Seats. We'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to say that I'm sorry to say that Senator Unterman called me this morning. Her brother had emergency surgery last night, and something didn't go well, so they had to go back in this morning, and so she is at the hospital with him. She is going to try to leave when he gets out of surgery. She wants to make sure things are good there and try to get here for our meeting, but she may not make it at the rate she's going. So please remember Senator Unterman and her brother in particular, as that's what's going on with her. Thanks for everyone coming out today. I'm Senator Kirk, and this is Senator Robertson. We're going to be bearing the brunt today. I called for this study committee, and you'll bear with me a little bit. This is the first time I've really been out a whole lot since June. I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, very rare liver cancer, and very aggressive liver cancer, and I've been through bouts with chemo, and I'm now on some cutting-edge stuff with Emory. In fact, I'll be going to Emory this afternoon for some scans to make sure this stuff's working like it's supposed to. But I feel much better. I'm able to be here. This was not possible just really a month ago. I wouldn't have had the energy and the strength to be here with you today. But I'm excited to be here because I'm the one who called for this study committee, Senate Resolution 371, and the reason is that during the session towards the end, the Supreme Court made a decision that we couldn't continue to follow sexual predators after they had served their probation period and all the time. And I got a phone call from one of my counties. I won't tell you which one because I don't want to get into small counties, small towns. People can figure things out. So it's one of my 9. But law enforcement called me and said, "Senator, we got a guy we've been tracking since the 90s, and we're going to have to go take the ankle monitor off of him. And here's what's going on with him." Said even though he's not breaking the law, he's right on the line. We've found pictures of boys in their underwear on his computer, but the GBI said that's not quite enough to prosecute. But you know what he's doing, and they said we know what he's doing, but we're going to have to take that ankle monitor off and not monitor him anymore, not go by and check on him anymore. So I said, well, that's problematic, and we got to do something. And so what I would like to send is a message, and I'm hoping that we'll have some legislation come out of this, because I want to send the message that if you're a sexual predator, Georgia's not the place you want to be. You don't want to live here. You don't want to come here. You certainly don't want to get caught here. We don't want you in our state and messing with our children. Children are vulnerable, and we need to do everything we can to protect them at all times and all costs. And there's certain lines in life that when you cross, you don't get a redo. There's certain things that you just don't get a redo on, and that's one of them, in my opinion. So I asked for this study committee. I don't know what can be done. A lot of times I have a lot of good ideas that I go to Senate council over here and all, and they say, well, that's good, Senator, but it's not constitutional. So we have to stay within the Constitution. Don't want to do that. We want to do it right. But we also want to have some of the toughest laws in the country for those who choose or whatever you want to get into. I don't even have that debate right now. But for whatever reason, they get caught up as sexual predators. We want to send that message to them. So that's how this committee was formed. I appreciate Senator Robertson being here with me today. I'll say one more thing. I told you I'm dealing with cancer. I've got a scan this afternoon at Emory, and I'm kind of in a catch-22. So I'm going to do one of two things at 12:30. I'm going to turn the meeting over to Senator Robertson and leave it in his capable hands, and I'm going to leave because it's weird. This medicine I'm taking, I can't eat 2 hours after I take it and then I can't eat 2 hours before I have my scan. So I got a 30-minute window between 12:30 and 1 that I can eat. And if I don't, it'll probably be 5 o'clock before I get to eat today. And I get a little cranky if I don't get to eat before 5. So I'm either going to have my admin bring my lunch down to me at 12:30, and I'm going to eat in front of you, and I just apologize for that now. Or I'm going to turn it over to my good friend here and let him finish the meeting. So we'll play that by ear as 12:30 comes. Probably depends on how I feel. All right. So with that being said, the first group we got up is our Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia.
You have the clicker right there, and then just forward it back.
And I've cut that mic on. Yeah, if you'll pull that one around and see. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Lelaine Briones. I am with the Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia. And today what we intend to do is present the state of the law and what could possibly pass constitutional muster with regard to GPS monitoring of sex offenders. To begin with, there have been studies. There is a lot of efficacy with regard to monitoring sex offenders. The National Institute of Justice sponsored a study on the effect of satellite-based monitoring on sex offenders in California. Those placed on GPS monitoring had significantly lower recidivism rates than those on traditional supervision. In fact, they found that 38% more arrests were recorded in the group under traditional supervision as opposed to those placed on GPS monitoring. What started out was Grady versus North Carolina. It is a Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court reviewed the case of a two-time sex offender subject to North Carolina's lifetime satellite-based monitoring program. He argued that the device violated his right to be free from unreasonable searches under the Fourth Amendment. In deciding this case, the United States Supreme Court looked at two previous decisions, United States versus Jones and Florida versus Jardines. In United States versus Jones, the Supreme Court determined that the government's installation of the GPS device on a defendant's vehicle and its use on that device to monitor the vehicle's movements constituted a search. They've decided this under the common law trespassory test. The government physically occupied private property for the purpose of obtaining information. Such a physical intrusion would have been considered a search within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment. They then looked at the Jardines case. This case actually involved a canine. There was no warrant in this case. The law enforcement officers had the canine go onto the defendant's porch. And what the Supreme Court said was, at the Fourth Amendment's very core stands the right of a man to retreat into his own home and there be free from unreasonable governmental intrusion. That right would be of little practical value if the state's agents could stand in a home's porch or side garden and trawl for evidence with impunity. The right to retreat would be significantly diminished if the police could enter a man's property to observe his repose from just outside the front of the window. So essentially, the Supreme Court reviewed the text of the statute, which was North Carolina statute, and what it required technically was that time-correlated and continuous tracking of the geographic location of the subject and reporting of the subject's violations of prescriptive and proscriptive schedules or locations. So based on the statute's language, Jones and Jardine, the court held attaching a device to a person's body without consent for the purpose of tracking that individual's movements was in fact a search. What the Supreme Court held was this was a search, but they never answered the question of whether it was a reasonable search. They left that to be remanded to the North Carolina Supreme Court. So they never answered that question. That question remains open today. What is reasonable? So we then go to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, the Ballou versus Wall. And in this case, the question presented was, in 2006, Wisconsin enacted a statute requiring that persons released from civil commitment for sexual offenses wear a GPS monitor 24 hours a day for the rest of their lives. The statute applies to any sex offender released from civil commitment after the first day of 2008. Ballou claimed that the statute violated his Fourth Amendment rights, as well as violating the ex post facto clause of Article 1 of the United States Constitution. Judge Posner stated that our Supreme Court held that civil commitment of sex offenders who have completed their prison sentences but are believed to have a psychiatric compulsion to repeat such offenses is not punishment as understood in the Constitution. It is prevention. The aim of the ankle monitor statute is the same, and the difference between having to wear the monitor and being civilly committed is that the former measure is less likely to be perceived as punishment than it is being imprisoned in an asylum. So what Judge Posner basically said was, this statute is constitutional because it is prevention, not punishment. Now that we move to the Park case, the Georgia case. Park argued that under 4114E, it was unconstitutional on its face because it authorized an unreasonable, lifelong, warrantless search of sex offenders who are classified as sexually dangerous predators by requiring such offenders to wear and be monitored at all times through a GPS monitoring device. So the question before our court was, does this qualify as a search? So Grady answered that. Under Grady, yes. Attaching this to someone's ankle would be a search, but is the search reasonable? And the court concluded that it was unconstitutional on its face to the extent that it authorized searches of individuals like Park, who were no longer under any part of their sentence. And they left that specifically to persons who were no longer under any part under their sentence. So further, does the state act qualify as a search? That's the first question that should be evaluated when considering new legislation. And is the search reasonable? Whether a warrantless search is authorized can be looked at under two prongs. One is whether the searches involved may be reasonable under the Fourth Amendment due to the individuals having a diminished expectation of privacy. And the other exception is whether the warrantless search authorized by the statute may be permissible based on special needs. The special needs exception deals specifically with things like the airport, searches at the airport, searches at the border, searches that we can have at this government building to make sure that the folks who work in this building are safe. So those are the sort of the special needs exceptions. So, diminished capacity, who would have diminished capacity? That's basically inmates. Our Supreme Court has basically said inmates in a prison have diminished capacity. Therefore, parolees also have diminished capacity because they are still serving their sentence. They're still under sentence. They're being permitted to be paroled, but still under sentence. Others who have had diminished capacity are also probationers, and basically anyone currently under sentence or supervision. So we go back to the Parks case and the directions or the suggestions of Justice Boggs. He stated specifically, nothing in our decision today precludes the General Assembly from authorizing life sentences for the worst sexual offenders, and nothing in our decision prevents the General Assembly from requiring a sentencing court in the worst cases to require GPS monitoring as a condition of permitting a sexual offender to serve part of their life sentence on probation. There is one state that has within their sentencing structure a requirement that anyone sentenced under certain sexual offenses must wear a GPS monitoring device, and that is Michigan. And that is Michigan Statute 750.520N. And it reads, a person convicted under Section 520B or 520C for criminal sexual conduct committed by an individual 17 years old or older against an individual less than 13 years old of age shall be sentenced to lifetime electronic monitoring as provided under Section 85. They've made this part of the sentence at sentencing. They also put a provision in there whereby the monitoring program is conducted by their Department of Corrections. And specifically, it's a very detailed program because what it allows is tracking the movement and location of each individual from the time the individual is released on parole or from the time until the person's death. And it also allows for the individual's movement and location may be determined both in real time and recorded information retrieved upon request by the court or law enforcement. So there are several sexual offenses in Georgia that do have a life sentence or probation for life, and the first one is rape. It is punishable alternatively by a split sentence that is a term of imprisonment for not less than 25 years and not exceeding life imprisonment, followed by probation for life. Then we also have aggravated sodomy by a split sentence that is a term of imprisonment for not less than 25 years and not exceeding life imprisonment, followed by probation for life. Child molestation, a second conviction, also permits by imprisonment for life shall be subject to the sentencing and punishment provisions of Code Sections 1710 6.2 and 1710 7, and also aggravated child molestation. Imprisonment for life or a split sentence that is a term of imprisonment for not less than 25 years and not exceeding life imprisonment, followed by probation for life. And our courts have said that superior courts, as a condition of probation, can order GPS monitoring. That's been clear. And the last one is aggravated sexual battery. Split sentence that is a term of imprisonment for not less than 25 years and not exceeding life imprisonment, followed by probation for life. So how do we pass constitutional muster? Does the state act qualify as a search? Is the search reasonable? My understanding of the law is that those with diminished capacity, if it's part of their sentence, could pass constitutional muster. Also, another thing that could be considered is a provision that allows either the defendant or the Department of Corrections to petition for termination. Wisconsin statutes allow the defendant to petition for termination after being on the GPS monitor for 20 years. There's also another provision which allows their Department of Corrections to petition the court to remove the monitor if the defendant is incapacitated or is no longer considered to be a threat to society. So in closing, there is current legislation with regard to these GPS monitoring devices. A petition for a writ of cert was filed in the United States Supreme Court in September, and that's Kaufman versus Evers, and it's challenging the Wisconsin statute. And the question presented before the Supreme Court is, can the state of Wisconsin subject child sex offenders and repeat sex offenders to lifetime location tracking consistent with the Fourth Amendment? So again, another consideration to make sure that any statute that is drafted passes constitutional muster is to make sure that it also does not violate the ex post facto clause, that there is a specific date certain when the statute goes into effect for those who are sentenced under the statute, and that would be it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Hang on a minute. Do you have any questions, Senator?
Just really quick, man. I'm sorry, I just turned it off.
I got you.
Currently, do we have sex offenders in Georgia that have been sentenced to life?
Yes, we do. We
Okay.
do.
Those sex offenders, are there certain conditions when it goes to searches where someone from their probation officer can come to their home, knock on the door, and they are required to allow that probation officer to enter their home and to look around for items that, plain view for the most part?
Yes, when I prosecuted child abuse cases in DeKalb, when a defendant pled guilty, he literally signed a form that allowed the Department of Corrections and probation to go in and search his home, as well as to search his computer for things such as child pornography. So again, these are all conditions that the court is permitted to require the defendant to follow.
And we did the same thing in Muskogee County. At one time, I managed an agency of almost 400 law enforcement officers, but I managed a population of approximately 500 sex offenders in Columbus. And the search that's conducted with the officer walking into the home and it being part of the sentence, wouldn't that be the same type of search that would be conducted if they wore an ankle monitor and were geo-fenced into a web-based program or whatever? Wouldn't those searches be very similar if they were both a condition of sentencing?
Yes,
Okay.
I believe so.
And do you believe those with the case law you've laid out now with the Park case and other things, would those stand a constitutional challenge, do you believe?
My thought is that our United States Supreme Court has said basically that prisoners have a lower expectation of privacy. So anyone under sentence is going to have a lower expectation of privacy. So if these conditions are made as part of their sentence, or part of their conditions of parole, or part of their conditions of probation, I do believe that will pass constitutional muster, again, as long as we're not violating the ex post facto clause. And another consideration is to consent. Allow them to consent to the searches, because there are many defendants who, you know, if you're trying to negotiate a plea, would rather knock off 2 years of their sentence and consent to GPS monitoring for life, you know, in that sort of negotiated plea. So I think those things will or could pass constitutional muster.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. It looks like we've got some precedents then, like in Michigan, and that we can work off of, and we actually have some things already in place in Georgia. So, but we need to beef it up. All right, GBI is up next.
Do y'all have the handouts we sent over, or do you need copies of them?
No, we should have.
They do, okay.
I'll take it. Yeah.
Are these the handouts?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Is there-
Very clever.
Does anybody else see one? Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Elizabeth Bigham. I'm a special agent with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and I'm currently assigned to our Child Exploitation and Computer Crimes Unit.
And good morning as well. I'm Tony Lima. I'm the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the GBI's Child Exploitation and Computer Crimes Unit.
So we work cases primarily involving child pornography and the online exploitation of children, sort of anything that falls in that realm. We also work cases involving child sex trafficking as well. We're tasked with that by the governor. So I wanted to put together a couple of studies for you guys. I tried to put them in a handout to hit the high points so you weren't bored to death with all the mundane information in them. But the Butner study is one of the biggest studies that we work off of, and we found this study a few years ago. It is from 2008. It's a bit dated, but it still reigns true today in most every case that we see and work in my unit. So it was conducted by Dr. Michael Burke. He was head of the Behavioral Analysis Unit for the U.S. Marshals, and Butner is a prison in North Carolina where many sex offenders go. And they did a study there back in 2008. And basically it started with 155 men that were arrested for possession, receipt, or distribution of child pornography. And if you'll see in that second kind of yellow Post-it note up top, at the time of sentencing, 115 of them had no documented hand-on victims, nothing. They were just arrested for child pornography. 40 of those 155 did have some sort of hands-on offense, whether it was a self-report or a DFACS report or something like that, and one did have criminal sexual contact with an adult. So their goal was to basically determine whether or not these guys that are just looking at child pornography are also committing hands-on offenses. So at the time of sentencing, they had about 75 victims based on self-admissions, DFACS reports, et cetera. So the methodology that they used was they did some therapeutic activities, Dr. Burke did with them. It was a 60-week psycho-educational series, and the biggest kicker in the whole study was a polygraph examination. So they utilized polygraph with these guys, and at the end of the study, 131 of them, or 85%, had admitted to at least one hands-on sexual offense with a child. So after they did interviews and debriefed all these guys, they had about 1,700 victims between all of them. So it just kind of goes to show you that they're not just looking at child pornography or downloading it or distributing it. The next page is just some of the quotes that Dr. Burke put in there that I thought were really important. The exposure to child pornography normalizes child-adult sexuality, dehumanizes children, and desensitizes the offender to the harmful consequences of child victimization. Another one was their deviant sexual arousal was not limited to their fantasy. Rather, when an opportunity arose, either incidentally or as a result of a planned predatory effort, many offenders molested or raped children and engaged in a variety of other sexual deviant behaviors. And my favorite quote from the study was, results of this study suggest that many internet child pornography offenders may be undetected child molesters, and that their use of child pornography is indicative of their paraphilic orientation. So what we did after we kind of discovered this study was started working our child pornography cases a little bit differently. We started investigating them further and inquiring about hands-on offenses, and if there were children in the home, ensuring that they got forensic interviews, and we started noticing that we were finding victims. That while we were there just for child pornography, we were finding evidence of hands-on offenses with victims, with children. There was another study that was done in 2014. It's the next page, the use of tactical polygraph with sex offenders. I like this study because it's a little bit different. It wasn't interviews with sex offenders. It wasn't anything like that. It was simply someone pulled 127 cases, federal cases, for targets that were under investigation for child pornography. 73 of those were identified as having no known hands-on history prior to the test, and afterwards, all 73 disclosed sexual abuse with minor children. So they were able to identify 282 victims, or I'm sorry, there was 282 victims discussed, 97 were identified, and at the time of the polygraph, 10 of them were actively molesting a child. So there's definitely crossover from guys that are just looking at child pornography or distributing it, and also the hands-on offenses. The last handout is information or stats from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We work very closely with them and get the majority of our cases from them. And back in August of 2018, they had seen about 251 million images and videos depicting child pornography. They are kind of like the clearinghouse for all the child pornography that's distributed around the world. Of those 251 million, only 15,000 children had been identified in those images and videos. So we have that many more children that we have no idea who's molested them, who they are, where they are at, or anything like that. That was August of 18. I updated the stats from NCMEC in August of 19. We were up to 293 million images and videos in just 1 year. And we had only identified 17,000 kids. So we have this huge gap with these guys or ladies that are molesting kids and producing child pornography, or just looking at child pornography but also molesting kids, and they're undetected.
Well,
Go ahead.
and well, go ahead. No, you go ahead. And I'll jump in a minute.
Okay. I did come up with one case example that we worked recently, just to bring it kind of back home to Georgia. There was a case with a defendant in DeKalb County that I worked a couple of years ago. He was arrested in 2017 by Newton County for inappropriate conduct on the internet with an 11-year-old child. He was talking sexually to her. It was extremely clear from the messages that he was coming to pick her up for sexual purposes to bring her back to DeKalb County. He was arrested on one count, bonded out almost immediately, no conditions on his bond as far as children were concerned. And when I was requested in April of 2018 to help with that case, we downloaded his cell phone and found that he was producing child pornography of his 2 children as well as their friend. I arrested him in July of 2019, and when we did forensic interviews with his children at that same time, we learned that he had been molesting them up until 2 weeks before I arrested him. So he was on bond for a charge in Newton, and he had still molested his children that entire time we were working the case. And we just felt that was important to show that just because he was arrested once doesn't mean he stopped what he was doing. And he was also producing child pornography. So.
Well, I was just going to make the comment, years ago in another life, I worked, I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I work with Department of Family and Children's Services, and I work with Child Protective Services. And we had cases where children were molested in the home by a parent. And you know, it's just the dynamics of that just run so many different directions. Because one of the problems is the kids grow up thinking that's normal because this is what I grew up in, you know, and they don't know that it's something. And just doing that forensic interview and working with a child and not knowing where that child is, you know, what they've been through, and there's no wonder there's so many that you'll probably never identify, and they'll grow up
Right.
as adults, and some will do the same thing that happened to them, and some will never do it because they realize somewhere along the line, hey, that was crazy, that was wrong, what happened to me. So, gosh, thank y'all for the work you do, and thank you for bringing us this information. Senator, you got any other questions for the GBI?
Just really quick, and not a question. I was graduated from the National Academy in 2010, and one of the things I did was a case study there and looked at a longtime public defender in the Chattahoochee Circuit, and he was arrested for molesting a child during a camping outing. And I received the case study at Quantico and had to call my supervising agent, let them know I had child porn. So they had to come and register all the stuff in my room because it was a horrific batch of photos and other things. And reading through it, before he was arrested for the one victim, there had been at least 16 other victims prior that started when he was in law school. And so I think a lot of times people don't realize that once we get to where that one bomb has landed, that the collateral damage has been all around that individual that goes unreported. And a lot of times, to what the chairman said, is because the victims do not realize that they're victims.
Correct.
Those forensic interviews are so important to get those children in a safe environment, have that conversation. And even though polygraph at times is a questionable tool, tactical polygraph is an extremely valuable tool
Yes.
in these kind of cases. And I sleep so much better at night knowing as a grandfather of 3 young girls and as a father of a 6-month-old baby girl, knowing that you guys are working as hard as you do. And of course, I use the data, the digital resources y'all have to let me know when I need to be concerned about a registered sex offender moving into my neighborhood.
Right.
Yes.
Here. And I appreciate the hard work you guys do each and every day.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Real quick, if we have a moment, you mentioned when you opened about the case that I guess one of the counties called you about with the images and videos. So something interesting about that, we run into that a lot as well. So those images that you describe where they're in their underwear, those are not illegal in Georgia. They are illegal in some other states, but it's called child erotica. Are you familiar with that term? I mean, it's probably good that you're not familiar with that term, but so that's different than child pornography. So in Georgia, we have, I believe it's 7 or 8 definitions of what we can charge child pornography for, but if there's not a lewd and lascivious exhibition of the genitals or the child's engaged in a sexual act or something along those lines, we can't charge a child in their underwear. So you run into some issues. I'm currently working a case with an 8th grade teacher, and he probably has 500 plus images like that, and I can't charge him. I've got a few images I can charge him on, but that's about it.
Well,
So-
we may see we can help y'all out a little bit.
Something
with
to
that.
think
And I'm sorry, but to that point, wasn't there some concern when the law was written that, you know, moms and dads and grandparents taking pictures of their grandchildren?
Right.
God bless, I've got a son who's 24 years old, and I know there's a picture of him somewhere where all he's got's a baseball.
Oh, I've done it.
He's sitting there, he's a few months old, he's sitting there holding a baseball, you can't see anything. And I know there was a lot of concern at the time because of some of that. But on the child erotica thing, it's a combination of all the evidence.
It's kind of a
It's not
totality
just
of the
that.
That's right.
circumstances.
Exactly.
It's
not
more
walking
that,
in and seeing that 8x10
yes.
on the.
And we have
That's
common
right.
sense enough
That's
to
right.
know not to charge a
Exactly.
kid in a bathtub if it's on a mom's phone or a dad's phone. But if there's 500 other images of new children,
But a lot of times, the pushback we get from people on the other side of the line is the fact that, well, this could just be absolutely innocent.
Mm.
You know, nobody has 47 pictures of their grandson, granddaughter.
naked, exactly.
Just don't do that.
Exactly.
Normal- my definition of normal. is,
Right.
I'm sure warped, but they just don't do that.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I think that
and-
with these
Go ahead,
crimes
Tom.
too, it is kind of a stepping stone, like we talk about drugs, gateway. You know, you have someone that starts looking at this child erotica, not the picture of just their kid in the bathtub, but kids that they find online that are dressed possibly in see-through type clothing, you know, but not in any type of sexual position. They look at that, that escalates their interest. Then they go to full-blown child pornography. I know we had a case recently that we interviewed the guy, and he had been looking at it for years. I mean, he admitted to us in an interview he'd been looking at it for approximately 12 years. His had escalated to the point, and when we interviewed him, we asked him, because he described it as taboo. He's like, well, what interested me in it was so taboo. And then I got a sexual interest in it, and then I asked him, I said, is there any other taboo type things that you are looking into? And he kind of looked at me, and I said, like bestiality? And he hung his head, and he said, yeah, I'll look at that as well. So this is that stepping stone, and I think that's also going to correlate to what Agent Bigham mentioned earlier. It's not just going to be looking at these images, it's going to be an advancement of their interest to start doing the hands-on offending as well.
Well, in making it only applicable towards those who are charged, I mean, it
Right.
would also take care of your concern about grandparents now, because, yeah, we have 9 grandchildren, and I know one of the first grandchild, they took a picture of her in a jar of jelly beans, and that's, and just, anyway, somebody pitched a fit about that, just
Oh,
crazy
gosh.
stuff. But, but we don't want to create problems like that for grandparents, that's for sure, but making it applicable that to say that if you've been charged and you can't even look at that, you shouldn't be looking at that. And if
Right.
you do, then that is an offense that you guys can call them in on. And
Right.
so, okay, all right. Thank you guys so
Thank
much,
you.
agents. All right, we have the Department of Corrections. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Both your mics are on, gentlemen. That is correct. The number's 1,200. Do we have a copy of the PowerPoint? Do we have a copy of the PowerPoint you guys are going to use?
Yes, sir. I'll be
Since
working
we're
off
in
this one, the data, and then Mr. Mann will be working
Okay.
off a different one.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Rob Thorne. I oversee legislative affairs for the Department of Corrections. I have with me today Mr. Kenneth Mannell, who is the director of our offender administration unit for the department. To start off, I'd like to give you a snapshot of the sexual offender population within the department, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Mannell to discuss the classification and programming side of this presentation.
Okay.
So I'm going to go off the first PowerPoint. I don't have the presentation up. I'm just working off the
Sure.
slides. So the first PowerPoint, the sexual offender data. Over the past 8 fiscal years, including current fiscal year 20, Georgia Department of Corrections has seen an average increase of 183 offenders designated as a sex offender each year, starting with 9,876 offenders in FY13 to a current population of 11,154 offenders in FY20. This population is spread throughout majority of the state prisons, transitional centers, private prisons, county correctional institutions, and secure alternative facilities. There are 20 facilities that offer specific programs that work to prepare an offender for release back into society, as well as 5 facilities that are specialized release sites for sex offenders that are deemed sexual predators. And the list is below you for sex offender program facilities and sexual predator release facilities. On the third slide, it's a bar chart of our sexual offender population and the increase from FY13. And then on page 4 is population broken down by facility type. So in our state prisons, there's 7,798 sex offenders. In our transitional centers, there's 313. In our private prisons, there are 2,850. In our county correctional institutions, there are 2. And in our secure alternative facilities, there are 191. And the last slide is sex offender predator profiles. The Department of Corrections and the Department of Community Supervision houses and manages, respectively, roughly 800 sexual predators, with a little over 300 offenders currently incarcerated. The incarcerated sexual predator population has an average growth of 30 offenders over the past 8 years, with the state housing 102 offenders in FY13 and currently housing 309 offenders in FY20. And we'll turn it over to Mr. Mantle now.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I will be discussing with you our programming that we do with sex offenders. It's commonly called our SOPP program, our psychological educational program. And really, you know, as a housing component, this is our program for our sex offenders. It's counselor-based. Our counselors are the facilitators for this program. The counselors, training-wise, they go through basically a 4-day training to prepare to teach this class. The class itself is roughly about 3 months long. There's 24 sessions. Classes are held twice a week, 2 hours per session. One of the key points of this is that we say it's not necessarily a treatment program, it's a psychological educational program. This program is one of the things that we bring up is that upon release, I agree to actively pursue treatment therapy services. This program does not substitute for therapy after I am released from prison. This program is not offered outside of the prison. If you have questions, this is where we tell the offenders. If you have questions about mandated therapy after release, you know, talk with either your probation, parole officer, DCS officer, or potentially the sentencing court. All of our state and private facilities could facilitate the program if they have a certified facilitator for that program. But as you saw in the previous PowerPoint, we have some facilities that are listed that do have those counselors available for that. Currently, we have about 2,869 offenders that have been referred to our SOPP program. So as those offenders are identified with our partnership with DCS and the sex offender unit that I believe you'll hear from next, we work closely with them. As those offenders are referred to the program, as offenders complete it, we rotate them out to another facility based on needs, and we rotate the new offenders into those programs to get that completion for them. And we currently have 361 actually enrolled in the program currently. This is just a kind of an example slide, really who's referred. And again, this is that partnership with DCS and the Sex Offender Administration Unit. Just some examples of who could go. Like the first one there talks about a case, a 1998 rape. They may have a rape charge and then they enter GDC in 2008 for a theft charge, even though the offender is required to register for the sex offense that may have expired. Therefore, offender would not be referred to SOPP. However, if that offender was still on some type of active supervision and they did come back to us, they would be referred at that point. So there's some guidelines there on who goes. But again, that partnership with DCS that's what really helps us push those offenders into that program. And then kind of close out with the last slide, our goals again. The focus for the offender is really on the reality of the harm that they cause the victim. Again, it's a class where they're there with other offenders. That's there to ensure that the offender recognizes the choices that they made, kind of how they came about those choices, and then really, you know, focus on making better decisions later on. One, what are those choices that got them there then, and what are the choices to kind of help guide them later on? Provide focus on sexual offending as abuse of power to meet one's own needs despite the cost to others. So again, a lot of times it's that power that they're trying to assert right there, so trying to help them understand that process. And again, as we kind of talked about, a forum for discussion relevant to the task of controlling one's behavior for the rest of their life. So again, that open forum, discuss that, hopefully understand where they came from. And then provide a setting for which the offender can practice new ways of handling feelings and urges. So that is our SOPP program. And again, you know, we have a close partnership with DCS and the Sex Offender Administration Unit.
So this is a fairly new program, I would take it?
No, sir. I don't have the time how long we've been doing it, but it's been a program that has been around for some time.
Well, you don't have many in it, though, at all. So, I mean, compared to the numbers that we have, I'm just curious about that.
I believe the program itself is a max of 15 per class.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a small group that we have. So as they come through, we push them into the program.
So some of the ones then who are in that number of incarcerated, they've already gone through this
Yes, sir.
program. So you're just looking at what's
Correct.
currently in the
Yes, sir.
program.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that makes more sense. Okay. And do they get any kind of, what do they get for going through the program? I mean, how does it help them as far as their sentencing or their probation or anything like that?
So for parole purposes,
Yeah.
parole is going to look at that they complete that program to be eligible for parole.
Okay.
If they do, they can refuse the program, and that could impact a parole decision.
Okay.
But parole is going to look at, yes, did they complete the program, obviously with a number of other circumstances of the crime, but they are going to look for the completion of that program.
So they have an incentive then
They do.
to go through the program. Okay. All right. Senator, do you have any questions?
Real quick, what qualifications are required to be a GDC counselor?
I will have to get back to you on that one.
My concern is we have a GDC counselor, they're trained in a 4-day specialized training program, right?
Yes, sir.
And the specialized training program focuses on the curriculum of the SOPP, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and then back at the institution they're in, a maximum of 15 individuals who qualify are required to go through a 3-month program in which they're required to attend 24 sessions
Mhm.
during that 3 months. Now, is 24 sessions all that's offered within the 90 days?
That is the program portion of it, but yes, sir.
Right. So in other words, it's not 60 days of programming, but they have to attend 24 days of it.
Yes,
They have
sir.
to attend every day that the program is up and running,
Yes, sir.
correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And one other quick question. On your slide where it says non-registrable sex offenders will not be referred unless the current offense is a felony sex offense that meets the criteria for registration. So some of individuals charged with sex offenses that do not meet the registration criteria are not required to go through SOPP.
Correct. And then I'll also, our sex offender unit partners may be able to help us answer that as well, but that is correct. Yes,
Right. Is there a classification process, or is that strictly based on Title 16 as to what's a registrable sex offense? Do you know that?
I don't know
Okay.
that one.
All right. And then however the court has ordered no registration or not required to register, this would then require an SOPP. So if the court even ordered a no registration, even though state law says that they have to be registered, they would still end up in the SOPP program?
They could, yes, sir.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah, if you would get that, I'd like to know what the credentials are too for the ones who are teaching the course. And I'd also like to know your numbers. I mean, I would think you'd have 100% going through it if it was contingent upon probation, but I would like to know what percentage of the offenders go through the SOPP program.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. All right, gentlemen. You have anything else?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank y'all.
Thank you.
Department of Community Supervision.
Are you gonna do the clip? Yeah, so just forward and back.
Good morning. Your microphones are on.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm James Bergman, Deputy Director of Field Operations with the Department of Community Supervision.
My name is Lori Rozier, and I am a criminal investigator supervisor over the Sex Offender Administration Unit.
I want to thank y'all for inviting us here to testify this morning. And you guys know, as a matter of practice, DCS doesn't take a position on pending legislation, but we are here to provide any relevant information that you need to make any decisions concerning the supervision of sex offenders. Okay, just to give a little background on sex offender supervision of DCS, offenders under DCS supervision for a sex offense that are registered sex offenders for a previous sex offense are placed on a specialized caseload. And what that does is allows us to train our officers as subject matter experts on sex offenders, so they have all the information on policy, law, and all that they need to do a good job of supervising those folks closely. The Sex Offender Registration Review Board's risk level does not impact DCS supervision. So all sex offenders under DCS supervision are supervised closely with a standard set of conditions. A sexually dangerous predator, excuse me. A sexually dangerous predator is defined in our policy as someone who was declared a sexually violent predator between July 1, 1996 and June 30 of 2006, or since 2006, a sexual offender who is determined by the Sexual Offender Registration Review Board to be at risk of perpetrating additional future dangerous sexual offenses. Sexual dangerous predators, like all offenders, are supervised according to the conditions that are imposed by either the parole board or the court. Electronic monitoring for our DCS offenders who are sex offenders are provided by STOP, Satellite Tracking of People, and the cost for that is $3.09 per day per offender. For sexually dangerous predators, that bill goes to DCS, so we provide the funding for the sexually dangerous predators who are under electronic monitoring. And the reasoning for that is, even though we're not legally required to do so, we feel like the sexually dangerous predators have other obligations, financial obligations, such as counseling, polygraphs, those sort of things that should take precedence over paying for the electronic monitoring. All sexually dangerous predators under DCS supervision are equipped with electronic monitoring. Let me back up just a little bit. For fiscal year 2019, we paid a total of $334,156 for electronic monitoring for sexually dangerous predators. Officers have the ability to establish inclusion or exclusion zones for electronic monitoring, so they can be notified when an offender has exited or entered one of those zones. So, in other words, an inclusion zone will be a place where one of those offenders should be. An exclusion zone will be a place where the offender should not be. Boy.
Okay, and looking at our numbers right now for DCS, for our total sex offender population, and when we're talking about total, we're talking about those that are in custody, maybe in custody out of state, as well as in any of our alternative programs, as well as those that are on unsupervised status, warrant status. So it gives you a big picture of the number. At this time, we have over 12,000 sex offenders that fall into that category. Of that, over 11,000 are male and over 300 are female. We also looked at our employment rate for our sex offenders of our total population, which is 76%. The average sentence length for this total population is 14 years, and that's looking at the time the judge is actually sentencing in court, not the average time that they would actually serve under supervision. Right now, for our total population, we have a total of 295 sexually dangerous predators. When we're looking at our actively supervised supervised offenders, these are going to be our offenders that our DCS officers are currently out seeing now. They're making contacts and interactions on these offenders. We have 7,536 actively supervised sex offenders. Of those, 7,313 are male and 223 are female. The percentage rate remains the same as the total population, as well as the average sentence length. We do have some high hit areas that do have a high number of sex offenders, and those are listed for you: Coweta, Atlanta, Stone Mountain, Chattahoochee, and Okmulgee. Right now, actively supervised population of sexually dangerous predators is 224. Here you will see a chart that basically goes over the total sex offenders as far as the total and active, as I defined before. And you will see that over the years, the number is pretty consistent. It kind of remains near about the same. Now, when we're looking at our actively supervised sex offenders by age, this graph just basically shows a breakdown of them. In the first quarter of this year, we had a 57% of actively supervised sex offenders. All of them fell in the age range of like 41. So that's a big number of those offenders in that age range.
Okay, so the question has been asked, what impact did the Park case have on DCS and our supervision of sex offenders as it pertains to electronic monitoring? The Park case didn't really impact electronic monitoring per se of sexually dangerous predators. What it did is impacted what happens when an offender is released from supervision, DCS supervision, whether it's parole or probation. So the way it was prior to Parks is that when a sexually dangerous predator discharged from supervision, our sex offender unit or the local officer would work with the sheriff's department to make sure that there was a smooth transition from electronic monitoring with DCS to electronic monitoring with that sheriff's department. In some cases, the equipment was actually transitioned from our department to another department. In some cases, we just made sure that the offender showed up and that it was removed, our equipment was removed, and the new equipment was installed. Since the Park case, now there's no longer supervision or electronic monitoring supervision required after discharge from parole or probation. So at this point, when they discharge from supervision, we remove the equipment and they're no longer required to be under electronic monitoring. It's important to keep in mind that any legislative remedy that allows for lengthier periods of supervision for sex offenders would, of course, eventually increase our supervision population. That in turn, of course, would create a need for more resources, would increase our caseload sizes and those sorts of things. You have any questions?
Well, I'll just say, were you aware I went on a ride-along earlier this year with some of your guys, and I saw what got a little taste of what they do, and that was interesting. That was before I realized I was sick with cancer, but that was a learning experience and kind of eye-opening, and yeah, we understand, but it looks to me like, too, the numbers that we got from the GBI, our numbers are going up anyway, so your caseloads are going to, I know y'all have a sort of a consistency there in the numbers you showed us over the last 3 years, but it looks to me like inevitably those numbers are going to have to go up anyway as those people serve time and get out on probation. That's when you pick them up. So what we're seeing is an increase in incarcerations and or convictions and incarcerations, and then eventually you guys will get them on probation, and so your caseloads are going to go up anyway. And we're also talking about that number around 300, really, that are, those sexually dangerous predators are the ones I really want to focus in on the most. So, Senator, do you have any questions?
On the sex offender population data as of September 2019, you said the average sentence length was 14 years. That is the average time that they are in contact with your team?
No, sir. That would actually be the average time that the judge is sentencing them from court.
Is that inside bricks and mortar, or is that outside in the free world also?
I'm not certain on that. I would have to get that information for
Okay,
you.
so that could be part of the probation also included into that 14 years?
I think it
Right.
could be a
Yes, sir.
combination, yes.
Mhm.
Okay, split sentence, if you will. Yeah, okay. And my ride-along was in Muskogee County. I had one member of your staff there, but the 3 officers I worked with were 3 females. And I'll tell you, as a 31-year law enforcement professional, I have not been impressed as much as I was with those 3 females that night, with the population that they were engaged in, the amount of knowledge they had to the laws and statutes, where they were able to articulate to the offenders what the rules were, to the point of we even checked on a homeless camp where probably 85% of the occupants there were registered sex offenders under your team supervision. And again, I was blown away at the professionalism, the skill set that they had, and the way they did their job. And y'all should be
Awesome.
very proud. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next we have Sex Offender Registration Review Board.
No, I don't think, we're not going to be going over all the slides. It's fine.
Representative Ballinger, good to see you.
Senator, it's always interesting to be on this side
Yeah.
rather than that side. So,
Yeah.
just to kind of give you a little background and kind of explain my presence here, I was, as a former victim advocate, this is something obviously in the protection of Georgia citizenry from sexual predators is obviously something that's near and dear to my heart. And also something that whenever there was some policy issues that came across, a dear friend of mine, my Solicitor General in Cherokee County, was on the sex offender registry Review Board, and she enlisted my help. We were able to get that fixed, but because of my stellar performance in fixing those policies and making them much better, I was asked to be appointed to the Sex Offender Registry Review Board. So Governor Deal appointed me to the Sex Offender Registry Review Board. So I currently sit on that board. So I get to review all those cases, and that's a tough job. So I'll
Well, anytime you do a good job, remember there's always punishment for that. I mean, a reward that comes with it.
So I will certainly do that. So just to start off, this is Tracy Alvord. She is the executive director at the Sex Offender Registry Review Board. So I just wanted to kind of skip through. The first few slides kind of go over the Sex Offender Registry Review Board and how it registers offenders, yada yada. But level 1 and level 2 are not really why we're here. We're here about the sexually dangerous predator. So
Right.
I will turn it over to Tracy to kind of go over the sexually dangerous predators and the importance of GPS.
Okay, thank you.
So I thought one thing that might be very interesting to you is that we have classified approximately 1,054 sexually dangerous predators. So we've classified about 12,000 sex offenders, 1,054 predators. So what that means is that if we identify them as predators, they're very, very bad in reference to the extent of their offending and their risk for reoffending. And 412 of those have been removed from GPS at this point due to the change in the law. So of course our concern is the same that you have. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for Supreme Court ruling.
I just wanted to specify that we weren't responsible.
Yeah, the Supreme Court hearing, I apologize.
It was the courts, not us.
The courts. So obviously we have the same concerns that you have. And I had included a couple of examples of 2 cases where sex offenders were actually identified who are identified as predators and then caught reoffending as a result of GPS tracking. And had that GPS not been there, they may not have been identified. How SORB determines and comes about their classification is a very complicated process. So it's very different than the Adam Walsh Act, which goes by conviction alone. So it's basically whatever he's convicted of, that's what we determine. In Florida, for example, all of they're tiered all as sexual predators. There's no in between. They do have sexually violent predators, and those are the ones that are confined in civil commitment, which Georgia does not have. So in Florida, they are compliant with the Adam Walsh Act, and they classify all of their tiers as sexual predators, except for sexually violent predators. Much more significant process, and they're confined for civil commitment, which Georgia does not have. I do not believe that would be included as, they'd be considered a sexual predator, potentially, yes. If it is a felony conviction. For a misdemeanor sex offense conviction, they're considered sex offenders. So misdemeanor sex offenders in Florida, any other sexual predator in Florida for felony, and there are special situations where they're sexually violent predators and they're confined civilly. So they can be confined for the rest of their life. And so in Georgia, of course, we have the sexually dangerous predator where we have GPS to monitor them. And we make those determinations based on not conviction alone, but we look at their entire criminal history, which is one thing. So for example, if we do have an individual who has statutory rape, we know that sometimes they plea down from a rape. So the 15-year-old girl says that she was raped. He says it was consensual. He pleads statutory rape. Somewhere who has Adam Walsh Act or a judge sentencing would identify them as a low risk because that, however, SORB, we look at their entire criminal history. So for example, we've had several cases such as that where they have a history of domestic violence against females, they have aggravated assaults against females, and they have family violence against children. We take that into consideration. That person most likely would not be a level 1 sex offender due to the apparent hostility against females. So if we had that, and then we have that individual who had a preference for teenage girls, we have more than one case. We've heard the other speakers talk about, we know that they're not always caught for everything that they do. But SORB has collateral information of other reports that maybe have been made but not prosecuted. And so if we see that there's a pattern of interest, so this individual has 1 conviction or 2 convictions, but they have a pattern of multiple victims, whether they're teenagers, adults, or children, then they're most likely going to be classified as a predator. So it's based on all that information, which also includes prison behavior. So we know in prison, sex offenders have committed sex offenses in prison, to include rape as well as exhibitionism to correctional officers. We also know that once they're out of prison in the community, there also are sex offenses that they engage in, or high-risk factors that we determine that's based on research. So if they're sexually preoccupied, or they're looking at pornography, or they're being around children and they're not supposed to be around children, they're non-compliant with supervision. We've had many cases where the offender is caught looking at child sexual abuse images and their probation is violated rather than being charged with a new sex offense. But we look at that, and that's considered a sex offense, obviously. And so that's taken into account as to what their risk is. And an individual with that kind of pattern is more likely to be a sexually dangerous predator.
Do you want to go over the GPS line?
So I know PAC actually spoke about the research that had been done in California, that there has been demonstration that has reduced sexual reoffense and has been a deterrent for sexual reoffense. I think it's going to be interesting for us right now. I keep track of, the clerk of courts are supposed to send me any new sentence, and so I get some of those, and sometimes I don't. So I have a very small number of individuals I can see who have reoffended since we have classified them. And so far, the highest number of those who reoffend are level 2 sex offenders that we've identified. We do not have many sexually dangerous predators that have been at least sent my way to know that they've reoffended. And I speculate that part of the reason for that is that we're being monitored. So I think it'll be interesting down the road for us to see, now that they won't be monitored after their sentence is complete, if that reoffending will start increasing due to the lack of monitoring for them.
So I got a question. At what point does someone get the title or the sexually dangerous predator? Is that something your board determines?
Yeah.
So that would be after sentencing then, right?
Correct.
In order to get that title, then they would have to had reoffended maybe and gone back to court for another offense, or how does that happen? What's the criteria? I don't know, need a detailed explanation, but
It's really, somebody gets leveled as sexually dangerous predator by the Sex Offender Registry Review Board. So if you're a member of the board, you get to read all the case files. So you get to read all the, basically there's kind of a synopsis that is prepared by staff at the Sex Offender Registry Review Board, and we get to review all of those. So all the offenses, the incidents, the descriptions by the victim of the occurrence, of the incidents of abuse, and we get to read all of those. And we actually vote on whether or not that person should be leveled as a sexually dangerous predator. So it's the totality of the circumstances. It's their previous convictions. It's other information, like Tracy was mentioning, instances of domestic violence, previous convictions outside of the state of Georgia. All of those, whenever we look at them, and it's their likelihood of reoffending.
So here's my concern. I don't know what the answer is, but so someone could be convicted of sexual molestation, whatever, but don't have the title sexually dangerous predator.
Mm-hmm.
But later on, the board says, no, this is a sexually dangerous predator. That's post-sentencing. So how do we capture that? Because to me, this needs to be part of the sentencing. Would that then require, if the board determines this, that case go back before the judge, and the judge then say, as a result of this title or from this board, then we're going to monitor you for life? I'm trying to figure out how that piece works.
It can. And Randy, Senator Robertson, you've probably been around long enough to remember the pre-sentence investigations, PSAs, that probation officers used to do. And so it would be a similar process. So the defendant would actually plead guilty, then it could be leveled, and then it could be dealt with by the judge, by the sentencing judge.
And some of this information could be vetted out in the discovery process, so that when the prosecutor prosecutes the case originally, they could petition the court to hear of similar actions prior to this particular action, which may bring a lot of information into the judge's mind on sentencing.
As far as the sentence enhancement.
Correct. But your guys' most of the people y'all classify are fresh out of the judicial process and moving into into the prison system, is that right?
Tracy, I know there has been a backlog. They actually got a grant from our Criminal Justice Coordinating Council to address the backlog. But Tracy, you could speak more specifically to the timing of the leveling.
So we don't classify anybody until they're at least within a year of being released from prison, and then there's some that have not been classified until years after release from prison.
And that's my concern with something Chairman Kirk was saying. So there's a possibility that somebody could go to court with all the information the judge needs, be sentenced, go to prison, do their term, get out, and then you guys classify them, and the only impact it has on that individual is the level of supervision they have while they're out of prison. Is that correct?
Yes.
So there's, whereas if the information had been gathered prior and it was information that was constitutionally allowed to be presented in court, or information that you could use to classify to help the Georgia Department of Corrections when they classify them at Jackson or wherever, to determine where that individual needs to be housed, because we know that sexual assaults and sexual predators continue to thrive in certain corrections facilities and environments.
Yes.
So you know, some of these individuals are what they are. They are what they are when they're arrested, and they are what they are when they get out without a lot of modification.
Rehabilitation.
Yes, ma'am. So that's my concern with, and I understand the backlog, and I can guarantee you, I can probably guess the reason there's a backlog. It's green. But that's a worrisome stat that some of these individuals go through the process, and when they're out of prison back into the communities of the individuals in this room, that they have yet to be classified as to what they really are.
And I think there's, I'm sorry.
No, to me, we got to figure out how to close that gap that could exist.
And I think that's a huge complicated piece, because I know that the Adam Walsh Act is one of the reasons that they brought that up, is so that they could be classified immediately. The problem is with the Adam Walsh Act, we look at tier 3s are actually inverted from tier 1s.
Yeah.
So in research, they found that the tier 3s are supposed to be the highest risk, or actually the lowest risk, and vice versa, because it's based on limited information. I know that when there was some legislation that was trying to be put forward regarding the judges doing the classifications, there was concerns by the judges themselves about doing that, because they know they don't have the information that SORB has. The other issue is that we have individuals who may appear to be not as high risk, such as what GBI presented, those individuals who research would suggest are low risk, but when we find out more information about them, we know they're actually high risk, and that doesn't necessarily come from at the time of sentencing. So there's a lot of gray area, and there's a lot of issues and complications to this, and that's the one thing that the board has struggled with in trying to decide what is the best case scenario to make sure that our communities are protected with these individuals, because there's many times we don't identify somebody as a predator until later, because we don't know all the information until later.
That's what I was getting at. Well, and anytime you have a complicated issue like this, it's always best to bring the attorneys in. So the next group up is the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I'm sure they're going to straighten it out, but y'all please have more discussions about that, and think about that and bring some ideas to us. Thank you.
Yeah, we actually do. SORB does have a legislative kind of committee that we've been working on, so I'll look forward to sharing some language with you probably next week or so.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senators, I'm Maisie Lynn Causey. I'm the policy advocate for GACDL, the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. To present to you today, I've brought a couple of our members. This is Jason Sheffield, Mark
Jason.
Yurachek.
Come on.
Mark.
Both of these gentlemen handle cases in both state and federal court. Both of them specialize in the types of cases we're talking about here today. They both have handled trial level cases as well as post-conviction cases. Mr. Yurachek has the distinction of being the lawyer who represented Joseph Park and brings us all here today. So I will not spend any more time introducing them, but let them tell you what we've got for you.
Okay.
My apologies for bringing all of you here today to listen to me speak. And Senator Kirk, I have a very, very close family member who's got cancer and is going through chemo right now. So I really sincerely wish you and your family the best. I know the impact it has, and I mean, I'm very hopeful for you.
Thank you so much.
I think I'm going to start and just sort of pick up where SORB left off and where your questions left off. And you give me great hope when you start asking about grafting the classification process into the sentencing procedure, because I think that is the direction where I think the Supreme Court was trying to lead us as well. I know I speak lawyer, and I'm trying not to speak lawyer for the benefit of the panel. There's no cure, unfortunately. It's a lifetime affliction. I don't know how familiar you are with the proceedings in Park. I'm going to assume you don't know much. So when we argued Park, the Supreme Court unanimously held that the search that was involved in that case was unconstitutionally unreasonable. Mr. Park was already off of all probation and parole. He had served his debt to society, and he was a registered sex offender who was deemed to be a sexually dangerous predator by the Sorbs process. He challenged Sorbs process all the way through the Supreme Court, didn't go his way, and then he was arrested for tampering with his ankle monitor, which was defective, but we can deal with that another day. Ultimately, what the Supreme Court said was that that's not reasonable. He's off of probation, he's off of parole, he's just Joe Citizen aside from this particular distinction, so he has the same expectation of privacy that everybody else does. Then you had 4 justices on the Supreme Court who wrote a concurrence, which was kind of a love note to you guys. It was actually, I know that PAC pointed out that it was Justice Boggs, actually Justice Blackwell who wrote it. And in the concurrence that Justice Blackwell wrote, which is not precedential, but like I said, I think it's meant for you, for this audience. The first thing that the justice suggested was that nothing in their opinion said that you couldn't extend every sex offense to a maximum lifetime punishment. And I think that's probably something that a lot of your colleagues would be inclined to do, but I'm going to tell you why it's not a good idea. First of all, it's a quick fix, but it's not a fix. And although I think that passage had some allure to a lot of people who read it, they may not have read on to the end of the opinion, but I'm going to read it for you. With respect to the potential rehabilitation of the Act, however, it is worth noting that the other serious constitutional concerns about the Act, separate and apart from the constitutional problem that forms the basis of our decision today, i.e. the ankle monitoring issue, have been raised in other cases, and the court took no action on those issues. I can say for myself that in Mr. Park's appeal, I believe we raised 6 separate constitutional issues, 5 of which were not addressed in the court's opinion. So obviously, I think you could get a pretty broad appeal for saying, hey, all of these are sex offenses, so let's just jack them all up to life. I'm going to tell you, number one, that doesn't stop me from coming back and challenging the statute in terms of vagueness, due process violations, ex post facto violations, which we kind of touched on today, double jeopardy, and cruel and unusual punishment, at least, if not more. It doesn't address any of those issues if you just change the sentences to maximum life so that you can alleviate the problem of being able to put anyone on lifetime probation with ankle monitoring. I think the second problem, an unintended consequence you have, was sort of touched on previously, which is that you potentially devalue the plea bargaining process. In other words, if it's a max life sentence anywhere, you know and I know that there are district attorneys in this state who are not going to really budge on negotiations in terms of reducing sentences for a lesser crime for someone who pleads out. Now, someone who gets convicted of rape and then pleads down to stat rape is still going to have to register as a sex offender for life. There are no exceptions in the First Offender Act for sex offenses, as a matter of fact. You guys saw to that. So the only thing that they're doing is taking a lesser sentence, and that's because they had incentive to plead down, take a lesser sentence, do less time, instead of roll the dice, go to trial on rape. If everything's a max life sentence and you get a particular kind of district attorney, that goes away and you're going to clog the system. And as much as that might sound fatal or doomsdayish, I feel quite confident that there are certain jurisdictions in this state that that'll happen. I want to touch on why I think, should this body choose to continue to ankle monitor registered sex offenders, which I will say I don't think is necessary, and I think Jason's going to touch on that a little bit. But should you choose to continue to do so, the right way to do it, I think, would be as part of sentencing. And I think the model for this would be federal sentencing. We mentioned a PSR, a pre-sentence report. If SORB were to be working with probation or engrafted into probation, move one more time, then a conviction for what is deemed a sex offense would then be referred over to probation to work up a PSR with all of the information that SORB now provides to me when I challenge a classification. Much of that information would have already come out in discovery as, for instance, similar transactions or prior convictions used to enhance a sentence anyway. Anything that didn't come out could come out in discovery as well, given notice that, should you be convicted, then we are going to seek classification as a sexual offender. And that also would assure the due process rights of the defendants, who I'm here advocating for today. Once the PSR is concluded and provided to the parties, each party has 30 days to make objections to what the PSR finds. There's then a hearing, a sentencing hearing, in front of a judge who decides according to a preponderance of evidence, more likely than not, that either A, the offender should be classified as 1, 2, or predator, or B, that they should not be so. But what this does is it cleans up a lot of what I consider massive due process concerns that exist in the system that's currently in place. I'll start with this. Right now, offenders are not entitled to an attorney. They're not entitled to an open hearing, at least as far as the initial classification, and they're not entitled to subpoena witnesses. The initial decision is made by SORB in closed session. As I understand it, there are up to 200 offenders per month that are classified. I find it a little difficult to think that SORB is peeling through all of those offenders' information with the care that should be placed on each one if any of them are going to be made to have their every movement tracked for the rest of their life with no hope of getting off of it. Instead of this, if you have an open hearing with the right to counsel, which attaches its sentencing, as well as the right to subpoena witnesses, the ability to have expert witnesses testify on their behalf, that takes away one of the really, in my opinion, strong arguments that the current system is not working. I'd also just like to point out, and this is not something that has really come up here, but right after Park, I argued a case called Walker versus SORB. And if you all are so inclined, you can go look up the oral argument. I really suggest you skip my part and go right to the Solicitor General's argument, because the court was aggressive in its questioning of him. And the tenor of the court's questions were exactly what you guys asked earlier. How do you know what a sexually dangerous predator is? OCGA 42112A21B says a sexually dangerous predator is one that is at risk of perpetrating any future dangerous sexual offense. What you have to know is the definition of a dangerous sexual offense also encompasses offenses against children, so what it means is any sex offense. Compare that to what a level 1 is considered, is to be a low risk of perpetrating any future sexual offense, or level 2, an intermediate risk. So in my opinion, flaw that exists there is that they're saying at risk for the most restrictive category of offenders. That broadens the scope and leaves it to SORB to sort it out. The problem there is that it doesn't give prosecutors, judges, the offender, certainly, or me, any real guidance as to who is going to be a sexually dangerous predator. It gets left down to the old legal saying, I know it when I see it. But the problem is that with the stakes that are here, ankle monitoring for life, total restriction of your liberty, increased reporting requirements. The sexually dangerous predators have to report every 6 months as opposed to a typical offender who has to report every year. With those things at stake, I got the strong feeling from the Supreme Court that they didn't think that that was sufficient. Now, what ultimately happened in Walker is that the court kicked it back down to the lower court in light of Park, and then chose not to take the case back up when we came back up with it. But I can assure you the next time one of those cases comes around my way, I'm going to be making that challenge. The problem with the way the statute is written is that it delegates too much authority to SORB without clear guidelines. That not only raises a problem of constitutional vagueness, it also, and this was pointed out by Justice Blackwell at oral argument in Walker, brings up a non-delegation issue. Non-delegation being a separation of powers issue. In other words, you're having a executive authority, SORB, is going to be vested with legislative powers, trying to define what a sexually dangerous predator is. I can tell you that in the hearing for Mr. Walker to have his classification judicially reviewed, I had the reviewer who had gone through his information and made the determination that he was a sexually dangerous predator testify that there is, quote, no template to distinguish a level 1 from a level 2 from a sexually dangerous predator. And that is a huge problem in the Constitution. I'm sorry, I've talked quite a bit.
Your time's getting close.
I'm going to hand it over to Jason.
Well,
Good afternoon.
if I could.
Sure.
So we can compartmentalize this as best possible. First of all, I want to tell you, I appreciate the work you did on Park. As a law enforcement officer, as someone outside of control of corrections, I think I would have questioned the legality of a search anyway. Once the person no longer belongs to the criminal justice system, then the criminal justice system no longer has an interest in the person for the crime that they've already served the time for, which would seem reasonable to me. And, I'm just a lowly deputy sheriff, but it made a lot of sense to me, reading the decision. I appreciate the work you did on it. Now, you brought this up. Is there not a guideline or consistent template that is used by SORB that you're aware of when they do the classifications? Or is this, you said 200 cases at a time, they go in a room and it's just, the British Parliament, everybody's hanging in there yelling at each other and deciding
The
what to do?
short answer is yes.
There is a template?
No.
No.
There is no template?
Not that's
classified?
public, not that's
No,
provided.
there's actually absolutely no template.
Because I know every
There's not.
Every county jail in the state of Georgia every large county jail in the state of Georgia uses a classification system that is a tried, true instrument that the NIJ and everybody else has looked at and beat up to make sure that the classification of inmates inside of the detention center is consistent. And then everybody that goes into the state system goes to Jackson, where they go through the DOC classification instrument, so they can be determined where they're going to be housed at this prison, that prison, high security, low security. So you answered my question. Neither one of you are aware of a formal instrument that's used
Can I just add
to
one thing?
classify. Absolutely.
Okay, the other thing is that SORB is not authorized by statute to propound its own regs. So any reg like that would be unlawful anyway. They couldn't follow that in contravention of the law.
So if I take your argument, then everything that SORB does is outside of the lines.
I don't mean at all to demean the
We're not
very good
demeaning
work that
anything. We're
Tracy
just having a
Alvord does.
conversation.
But I will say for sure that the position I've taken in court before, and the one I will continue to take until the law is rewritten, is that SORB is vested with way too much authority and way too little guidelines to assert that authority.
I think the issue is that you're empowering this body to create, because we're here to try to figure out how to track what could be several hundred people, right, who are deemed sexually dangerous predators at a time later than their sentence is imposed, right?
That's right.
And then, because of the desire of this committee and perhaps both senators to create life sentences so that they can be tracked for the rest of their life to be in compliance with Park.
Well,
You're giving that decision to SORB, and now they are judiciating a life sentence by
Right.
this black box procedure.
Well, but one thing I want to point out is I think everybody's in here for the right motive.
Agreed?
I think everybody's in here, and I don't think SORB is, I've never viewed them as some outlaw group that's
Agreed.
just trying to stack people away in prison.
That's not the
Because if I use the, you'll know it when you see it, which is ridiculous as ridiculous as that sounded when we heard it. You only have to look at a case like a John Wayne Gacy to realize that when John Wayne Gacy was arrested for his first offense where he touched a male person, if we took the SORB standard and we looked at his past history, we looked at his involvement throughout the community, they would say, well, you know what, he's a low risk. Well, then 30-plus young male bodies buried under his house later, we realize that he's a much greater risk than the state of Illinois realized. And so when we know it when we see it, in these certain cases, that it carries a little more weight than just, and I don't think you intended it this way, I didn't take it this way, than more than just a flippant remark made by a Supreme Court justice.
Well, yeah, that's
Yeah.
absolutely
And-
true.
yeah.
But I would also add that it goes back to what I was saying. If you have an amorphous statute that does not give fair warning to the people who are subject to it, then it's going to get kicked out in the courts anyway. That's the problem with any version of, you'll know it when you see it. Even if, I mean, there need to be clear guidelines. There need to be standards that attorneys, as well as judges, as well as those prosecuting the situation, whether that be SORB or whether it be the district attorney's offices, those standards need to be clear. They need to be published. They need to be available. And we need to be able to prepare for a hearing and say, well, my client doesn't fit that category. And like I said, I would refer you back to Walker, because that was a huge concern, I think, of the court. And I can remember that Justice Bethel specifically asked, how these lawyers know what to do? How do they know? So I'll leave you to that. But I also think that one thing that a sentencing procedure would also help with, which we haven't touched on yet, but there is also the question of continuing review. And that's something that's been brought to your attention today. One of the issues that was raised by the Supreme Court in Park as a reason why the search was unreasonable is because once you are subject to the GPS monitoring and have gone through the review processes, which happen right away. They happen immediately. You have 30 days to make your initial challenge to the classification. If that doesn't work, you have 30 more days to go to the Superior Court. Then the Superior Court makes a decision. You have a discretionary appeal with either the Court of Appeals or, in our case, the Supreme Court, because we made a constitutional challenge. Okay. Once that's done, you're done. You are on that for life. There is no procedure by which you can come off of it. But what we know is that the criteria for classification are dynamic, many of them. So they change with time.
Specifically, if you look at reoffense rates or predictions, when you're talking about a level 1 or a level 2 or a level 3, which is a sexually dangerous predator, one of the largest contributors to a decision that you are a lower offense to reoffend is time in the community. And so when you put someone in the community and they do not reoffend, even after they may have been designated a level 3, that in the community of people who test and evaluate is one of the biggest predictors of success in the future. And that can happen just after 2 or 3 or 4 years in the community. So it should be that there is a built-in component that recognizes the science. There's a 2012 United States Sentencing Commission report that is much newer than the 2008 single study that was done. This is a meta-analysis of these type of offenses, including hands-on offenses, as well as online offenses, because everybody wants to know, are online offenders like hands-on offenders? And I disagree with Special Agent Bigham's use of that single study. This 2012 meta-analysis with some of the best science at that time found much lower rates of reoffense. Matter of fact, a person in the community becomes a low risk, which means that they have a 1.3% chance of reoffense within 3 years. Sex offenders are known, and studies conclusively demonstrate, that they are lower to reoffend than violent offenders.
Is this a hands-on reoffend?
Hands-on reoffenders.
Right, but what
as
that
well
does-
as online offenders.
Well, I was about to say, with the explosion of online, do you think that the opportunity for them to to satisfy their fantasies and needs through voyeurism displaces
A
the
lot of it
hands-on
is-
cases?
A lot of it is satisfied
So
through
a
the
lot,
voyeurism.
so they are still offending, they're just offending in a different area.
They are.
Which is supply and demand, which means that we will continue to have a market that will feast
Sure.
on our children
Sure.
in order to satisfy these sex offenders so that they don't go out and put their hand on an actual child.
Right, but your ankle monitor's not going to do anything about somebody who looks at an image online. I mean, I
So,
agree with
so
you.
You're absolutely
last
right.
year, I served on the Judiciary Committee as a non-attorney. That was not a lot of fun. And I had a lot of these debates that went on. But I'm going to wrap you guys up. I'm going to give you 5 more minutes to finish it. But here's the problem. Information comes in after the sentencing, and this board's looking at that information and putting things together, and they're saying, you know what, with all this, and then we also heard testimony from the GBI that, you know, if they're looking at it online, that the statistics say one thing, and then they do the polygraph, and the numbers go crazy up. They actually were hands-on offenders, and they just, so I don't know what the answer is either. That's why I called the study committee together. I want to do it right, guys, I do. But at the end of the day, if you're a sexually dangerous predator, I want you followed for life in the state of Georgia, okay? I don't know how to get to that point. In our current system, it just doesn't work because there is a gap between sentencing and maybe the designation. I guess some people get that designation at sentencing, and they don't. It always comes afterwards. See, I didn't know that.
It never happens until you are either released from custody or you're put into supervised probation, and then at some point it does happen. My understanding is that about 70% of cases are still unresolved on this. They're supposed to do it within 90 days, but 70% of cases are
9 days
unresolved.
of sentencing or
Of
9 days
release.
Release, wow.
Maybe
Yeah.
it's 60.
It's prior release.
But for your consideration, Senator Kirk, one of the concerns that we would have is that you take all of the offenses that are considered sexually dangerous offenses, people that make sexual prank calls, a 19-year-old kid who sleeps with his 15-year-old girlfriend, he's a senior, she's a sophomore, a second pat on the tush, which is a sexual battery because that's an intimate part, right? That you take those and you say, okay, the resolution here is life sentences for all sexual offenses, and you're gonna throw your net out there to catch sharks, and you're just gonna catch dolphins as well, and that is that's not the best.
I would
way.
agree. I don't think that's the right answer.
Okay, well then we move away from that and we say, okay, then we've got to incorporate SORB into a judge's determination of whether or not this particular person needs to be a level 3 if you want it to incorporate for the rest of their life monitoring.
Which has the charm of the court maintaining jurisdiction over the case throughout the probation. So if, for instance, an offender comes back in 10 years, a year, whatever, and says, hey, I don't think I deserve this anymore, you've got a judge there to make that determination. You've got a district attorney to advocate for the other side, and you've got at minimum public defender, if not a retained counsel, to advocate for the offender as well, and you have, therefore, due process.
And under our current probation system, they still have that. If someone
They do.
violates probation, they go to jail, they still have access, most of the time, to the judge who sentenced them originally.
Sure.
They have the district attorney to argue the reason why they violated, and they're given access to counsel.
And we don't want you to shift the burden to the defendant to prove that they're not a sexually dangerous predator. We want the burden to be upon the SORB and the state to prove that they are. We would love it if there would be a fall-off provision in this law that they fall out of that category, and the state has to come back and prove that they are continuing to be a sexually dangerous predator. Because what we do know is good time in the community does, in the hands of professionals who all agree to this, does mean that you are not a risk to reoffend. Yeah, it's the 2012 report to the Congress, federal child pornography offenses, but it also included analysis into hands-on. Yes, I'll be happy to do that. Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, thank y'all so
Thank you,
much
gentlemen.
for
Thank you, Senators.
coming today. And Senator Utterman, how's your brother? I told everybody why you were out. Were they able to?
He had emergency surgery, and he's out of surgery in the intensive care unit.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And
Absolutely.
thank you for taking over and the next session and doing it diligently and expeditiously, and appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming and giving the information today. Yes. Oh, we do have public comment? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought, I can't see without my glasses. Here we go.
I do, based on their
Would you
testimony.
Would you come up front?
Brenda Spear? Is that right?
Spar.
Spar? Okay.
I do apologize, but just based on some of the concerns that were raised about SORB and kind of how we operate and how we classify folks, I just wanted Tracy to kind of clarify some of those issues.
Okay.
We do have standards on how we classify sex offenders.
Yeah.
So it's not just kind of a,
Who
that's what they
established those standards?
So we actually use the Static 99R and the Static 2002R, which was created by the researchers that Mr. Yurchek just discussed by Hansen, and those particular assessments are used nationally.
Can you give us a copy of those assessments?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, actually, it's online.
We're not just making stuff up.
No, I know.
Say for a minute, we don't do 200 cases a month.
Right.
There's no way we can do 200 cases. We average about 75, and we've got a group of people, which includes defense attorneys, district attorneys, all on our board that review these.
Right.
And so we're not just throwing people under the bus, as was presented here.
No, we understand that, and yeah. Thank y'all so much for the work you do too. And I don't know how we'll put it together, but that's going to be an integral part of, maybe delayed sentencing. I don't know. I don't know what the answers are, but we'll work with the attorneys and they'll figure it out. Okay, is Brenda here?
Brendan Spar.
Brendan
Yes, sir.
Spar. Okay,
Yes.
Mr. Spar.
So good afternoon. Thank
Good
you,
afternoon.
Senator Unterman, for making it today. My thoughts and prayers are with you and your family and your brother. My name is Brendan Spar, and 5 years ago, I pled guilty to a non-contact sexual offense in Forsyth County, Georgia. While my sentence didn't include any prison time, it did require 10 years of supervision. It required community service, mental health treatment, and placement of my name on the sex offender registry, as well as a sex offender review board evaluation. Once I became a felon with a sexual offense on my record, I was asked to resign from my job. I tried seeking other gainful employment and found it very difficult, nearly impossible with that background and that stigma. In fact, the Georgia Department of Transportation rescinded their job offer from me because I was on supervision. They said, the governor's executive order says that we have to give second chances, but you're on supervision, so we don't. Today, I've put that worst day of my life in the rearview mirror. Through required treatment, I realized that I was not making the best choices at the time. I let many people down because of my choices, myself, my family, my friends, my coworkers, everyone I cared deeply about, I let down, and I realized that through treatment, through this process. I've started my own consulting company. I'm working for myself now and helping small businesses and nonprofits in the Atlanta area. I hope to hire other people with similar backgrounds and similar stories. I serve alongside Senator Unterman on the board of the Greater Gwinnett Reentry Alliance in Gwinnett County, which earlier this year I asked for and received a proclamation from the Board of Commissioners for Second Chance Month in Gwinnett County to help people realize their second chances and that people can be redeemed. I also work with the Prison Fellowship Ministries. I'm a Justice Ambassador, and I approached Governor Kemp earlier this year to issue a proclamation as well for Second Chance Month, and he gladly did. So April was declared Second Chance Month in the state of Georgia, and I'll be back at his office next April and the April following. Second chances are not just a one-time thing, and second chances are for everyone. I'm also a policy analyst for the National Incarceration Association, and we hear these stories every day that are similar to mine. Once my 10 years of supervision is completed, I plan to vote in the 2024 election because my voting rights will be restored once I'm off of supervision. I also have a path to be removed from the registry, the state registry, once my supervision is complete and upon a low-risk assessment by the SORB. This path to restoration is not going to be possible if I have a lifetime of supervision. I won't be allowed to vote, and I will be forever on the registry. and the stigma of employment and housing that pertains. I don't believe that we should bind a judge, forcing them to give a sentence that's unjust. Each case is individual, and if we cast such a wide net, you're essentially saying that one group of people is irredeemable and uncorrectable, that behavior cannot be corrected by time in the community or treatment. We must consider rehabilitation over retribution. I sit here today as proof that rehabilitation and redemption is possible for those convicted of sexual offenses. Thank you.
Thank you. You got any questions?
Just one real quick.
Yes, sir.
Now, doing the second chance, do you encounter a lot of people that have the same types of charges and experience the same type of sentence that you've received?
I do, and second chances are very difficult to come by whenever it's a sexual offense. There's a lot of stigma and a lot of judgment goes along with that.
Do you consider yourself atypical in that population, or do you see yourself as somewhat of an outlier to a degree?
I do believe I'm an outlier. I'm a strong personality, and I do want to redeem myself. I do want to conquer this illness that I had 5 years ago, or actually the sentence was 10 years ago. So I want to conquer that and overcome it. I've realized the problem. I believe that a lot of offenders do realize, some don't. And so casting that wide net and saying that no one realizes their potential and that their error of their ways is not the right direction.
So it's okay for me to assume that not all offenders are exactly the same. Is that correct?
That's true. And if we tell a judge to treat all offenders the same and sentence lifetime for everybody, you're going to get the outliers caught up in that net.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I made it very clear as sexually dangerous predators are the ones that I really want to target out of this. So we're not wanting to cast the wide net and punish everybody, but thank you for coming and giving your testimony.
Thank you, sir.
All right, and there are no other public comment. We stand adjourned.